I was 72, and that night my car was my coffin. The leather seat dug into my back, the cold air pressed against the windows, and outside I could still hear the muffled laughter coming from the house I built with my own hands. My children had locked me out, told me I was a burden, and tossed me aside like garbage. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just stared at the cracked ceiling of my car and swore one thing. If they wanted me to sleep in my car, I'd make sure they ended up sleeping on the streets. The first night in that car was the longest of my life. Every creak of the old suspension reminded me I wasn't in a bed anymore. My neck stiffened against the headrest. The air was damp and smelled of rust, and the blanket I had kept in the trunk barely kept the chill from crawling into my bones. Through the foggy window, I saw the golden glow of my house, the one I had poured decades of sweat into, and shadows of my children moving freely inside, laughing, cooking, living. The same house where they had once run to me as children, barefoot on the wooden floors I laid plank by plank. Earlier that evening my daughter's words had been sharp as glass. "You don't belong here anymore. You'll drag us down. Sleep in your car if you have to." My son stood by, silent, arms crossed, as if agreeing with her cruelty. They didn't even let me take my favorite chair. I carried a small bag of clothes and the humiliation of being unwanted, while the sound of the door slamming shut behind me still echoed in my chest. As I sat in that car, stomach growling and throat tight, I noticed the curious stares of neighbors passing by. They recognized me. Their pity was worse than the cold. One whispered to another, pointing at my car, as if I had suddenly become a broken piece of furniture tossed to the curb. I clenched my fists under the thin blanket, not from the cold, but from the fire burning inside me. They thought they had stripped me of dignity, left me to rot, but in that silence, in that humiliating moment, I made a vow I would rise from this car seat and bring them down lower than they ever imagined. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something straight. What would you do if your own children threw you out of the house you built with your bare hands? Would you walk away quietly? Would you forgive them? Or would you wait and teach them the lesson they thought you were too weak to give? Tell me down in the comments, because I wonder how many of you would have chosen revenge like I did. And if you believe no one should ever be treated like trash, hit that like button right now. And don't forget, subscribe, because I've got more stories my children wish I'd never share. They thought they buried me in silence, but now I'm giving my silence a voice. Now, let me take you back to where it all started. Long before that night in the car, I wasn't always the man sleeping in a car seat, shivering under a blanket that smelled like oil and dust. No, once I was a builder, a provider, a father who worked until his hands bled just to make sure his children never had to know hunger the way I once did. I was born into nothing. My own father died young, and my mother did laundry for strangers just to keep us fed. I remember the smell of soap and bleach clinging to her hands, cracked and red from scrubbing other people's clothes in cold water. We lived in a single room with walls so thin that when the winter winds came, it felt as though the cold was crawling straight into our bones. I promised myself, even as a boy, that one day I would build a house strong enough to keep the cold out. A house my children would never fear losing, and I kept that promise. From the day I was 16, I worked construction jobs, long shifts under the sun, sometimes 2 shifts back to back. My skin burned dark, my shoulders hardened, and my fingers turned calloused. Every paycheck I got, I saved a little. No movies, no fancy clothes, no unnecessary expenses. While others my age were chasing thrills, I was chasing bricks, nails, and lumber. When I finally bought a plot of land, it felt like holding gold. I worked on that house every free hour I had. The smell of fresh wood, the scrape of nails, the sound of hammers, they became the soundtrack of my youth. I still remember the day I raised the first wall. My hands shook, not from weakness, but from pride. That wall wasn't just wood and plaster. It was proof. Proof that a poor boy could build something lasting, something solid. When the house was finally complete, it wasn't big, it wasn't fancy, but it was ours. The roof didn't leak, the walls stood strong, and the floors shone with the polish of my sweat. I can still smell the varnish I used on those floorboards. My children learned to walk on those boards. Their laughter once filled those rooms. Their small hands once clung to my arms as I carried them across the threshold, and I gave them everything. When my daughter wanted to go to university, I sold the last of my old tools to pay her tuition. When my son fell into debt, I worked overtime, pulling late-night shifts just to bail him out. I thought this is what fathers do. They sacrifice, they bend, they break, but they never stop giving. And I gave until there was almost nothing left for me, but I didn't care. Because I believe family was worth every sacrifice. The betrayal didn't happen overnight. It was a slow erosion. First came the small jabs. "You're getting too old for this, Dad," or "Why don't you just relax and stop worrying about money?" Then came the dismissals. My advice was brushed off, my stories ignored, my presence treated like a burden. I told myself it was just the way of things. Children grow, they change, they forget the struggles their parents endured. I convinced myself they still loved me, even if they no longer said it. Then came the day my wife passed away. That house, the one we built together, suddenly felt too large, too quiet, too empty. My children promised me I wouldn't be alone. "You'll always have us," they said. I clung to those words like a lifeline. But promises, I would learn, are lighter than smoke. After she was gone, their visits grew shorter, their calls fewer. My meals became lonelier. The sound of laughter I once knew turned into silence, broken only by the creak of the old rocking chair where I sat at night. I told myself it was fine. I had my memories. I had my home, but memories don't pay bills, and a house, even one built with love, still needs money to stay standing. My savings dwindled. My health declined, and instead of stepping closer, my children stepped further away. One evening, I overheard them whispering in the kitchen. They thought I was asleep. My daughter's voice, sharp and impatient, said, "He's draining everything. We can't carry him forever." My son replied, "He has the car, doesn't he? He can manage." They spoke of me not as their father, but as a problem to be solved, a weight to be lifted from their shoulders. That was the night everything changed. The confrontation came days later. I had asked if they could help me cover the utility bill. It wasn't much. I thought it was a small request, considering everything I had done for them. My daughter slammed her hand on the table. "Enough, Dad! We're not your caretakers. You're the reason we can't move forward. If you can't handle living here without being a burden, then maybe you shouldn't live here at all." I stood there, silent. My son didn't defend me. He just crossed his arms and looked away. I felt my chest tighten, not from anger, but from a grief deeper than any I had known. Deeper than the grief of losing my wife. Because this time, I was losing the very children I had given everything to. And then came the final blow. They told me to leave. They told me to take my car and figure it out. I stared at them, waiting for one of them to soften to take it back. But they didn't. They turned their backs, and I walked out carrying nothing but a small bag. The door closed behind me with a sound that echoed like thunder. That night, I sat in my car, staring at the house through the windshield. The same house that had once been my greatest pride now felt like a cage I had been thrown out of. I thought of every nail I had hammered, every wall I had painted, every sacrifice I had made, and I realized none of it mattered to them anymore. To them, I was just an old man taking up space. The cold seeped into my bones, but it wasn't the weather that made me shiver. It was the realization that the people I had loved most had discarded me, and yet, even as the pain pressed heavy on my chest, another feeling stirred beneath it. Not anger, not rage, something sharper, something colder. Resolve. Because in that moment, as I lay awake in the driver's seat, I promised myself one thing. They might have won that night, but the war was far from over. They thought they had cast me aside for good. They thought I was finished. But I was just beginning, and soon enough, they would learn that a man who built a home from nothing can just as easily take one away. The car became my world. Days blurred into nights, and nights into days, with nothing but the hum of the streetlights above me and the rattle of passing trucks shaking me awake. I parked in the same spot most nights, an empty corner near an abandoned warehouse where nobody would bother me. The car smelled of old leather and gasoline, a smell that clung to my clothes and made me feel like I was fading into the same rusted metal that sheltered me. Mornings were the hardest. My back screamed as I tried to unfold myself from the cramped driver's seat. The stiffness in my neck was like a cruel reminder of the bed I no longer had. Sometimes, as I walked into the gas station restroom to wash my face, I'd catch a glimpse of myself in the cracked mirror. An old man with hollow eyes stared back, but behind those tired eyes was something burning. A fire I thought had died long ago. It would have been easy to give up, to accept that this was the end of my story, but I'd been poor once before. I knew what it meant to scrape by, to survive on scraps and determination. My children thought they had buried me, but they'd only returned me to the same soil I'd once grown from. And soil, when pressed down, only makes seeds grow stronger. At first I survived on small things. The little money I had left in my pocket I used carefully. Instant coffee and cheap bread became my breakfast. Sometimes a kind neighbor, the one who had seen me sitting in my car, would slip a paper bag through the cracked window. A sandwich, an apple, sometimes even a thermos of soup. She didn't ask questions. She just gave me a look, the kind that said she understood more than words ever could. But pity was not what I wanted. Pity kept you alive for a day. Pride could keep you alive forever. One night, I sat in the car staring at the crumpled envelope that held the last of my savings bonds. I'd kept them hidden for decades, mementos from a time when every dollar I saved meant I was one step closer to my dream of owning land. They weren't much, but they were something. I realized I could either burn through them and end up with nothing, or I could plant them like seeds. The decision came to me as clear as the moonlight on my windshield. I would invest again. I reached out to an old co-worker from my construction days, a man named Frank. He had always been good with numbers, smarter with money than I ever was. He was shocked when he saw me, living out of my car, beard unshaven, eyes sunken. But he didn't mock me. He listened, and then he leaned forward and said, "You've still got fight in you, I can see it. Don't waste it. You know buildings better than anyone. Want to get into rentals? Rentals." The word sat heavy on my tongue. I had built homes, yes. I had repaired roofs, laid bricks, fixed plumbing, but I had never thought of owning multiple properties. Yet the more Frank explained, the clearer it became. Small apartments, run-down houses, places other people ignored. Those could be opportunities. And with my knowledge of construction, I could fix them up without paying a fortune. So I took the plunge. The first property I bought was nothing more than a broken-down shack on the edge of town. The paint peeled like sunburned skin, the windows rattled in their frames, and the roof sagged under years of neglect. Everyone else saw a wreck. I saw possibility. I slept in the car outside that place for weeks as I worked. Hammer by hammer, nail by nail, I brought it back to life. The smell of sawdust filled my lungs again, and for the first time since my children abandoned me, I felt strong. I rented it out to a young couple who were just starting out. They paid me month after month, and suddenly, I had income again. Not just survival money, growth money. With every dollar that came in, I bought another property. Sometimes it was an old duplex, sometimes a crumbling house that everyone else dismissed. And each time I rebuilt. My calloused hands, the same ones my children mocked for being old and slow, became the tools of my resurrection. Years passed. My hair grew whiter, my back more bent, but my pockets heavier. From one property came two. From two came four. Soon I wasn't the man living in a car anymore. I was the man quietly becoming a landlord, the man nobody suspected had risen from the ashes of humiliation. I never flaunted it. I dressed the same, drove the same car, kept to myself. Because revenge, true revenge, doesn't come from showing your cards. It comes from playing them at the exact moment your opponent thinks you have none. And then fate dealt me a card so sweet. I almost laughed when I saw it. One of the apartment buildings my children lived in, a fancy place with polished floors and tall windows, went up for sale. Their landlord was retiring, ready to cash out, and the listing landed right in my lap. I didn't hesitate. I had the money. I had the will. And I had the perfect reason. I signed the papers quietly. No celebration, no champagne. Just a pen scratching across the page. My name became the one at the bottom of the deed. And with that signature, the same children who once threw me to the streets now lived under my roof. But I didn't stop there. I made sure every detail was perfect. The rent notices, the official letters, the paperwork, All of it carried my name. I wanted them to see it, to feel it, to know that the father they abandoned in a car now held the power to decide if they had a bed or not. I remember the day they found out. My daughter stormed into the office, waving the eviction letter I had sent. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. "This is a mistake!" she shouted. My son followed quieter, his eyes darting around nervously, and then they saw me, sitting there, calm, steady, with the same eyes they once dismissed as weak. "It's no mistake," I said. My voice didn't rise. "It didn't need to. You made me sleep in my car. Now it's your turn to learn what it feels like to be left without a home." The silence that followed was sweeter than any applause. But that moment, as powerful as it was, wasn't the end. No, it was only the beginning of their downfall. Because while they thought eviction was the worst of it, they hadn't yet realized the depth of my plan. And that was the part that made my revenge truly unforgettable. Owning the building where my children lived should have been enough. For most men, maybe it would have been. Just the satisfaction of knowing the balance of power had shifted, that they now lived under my roof and paid me rent, would have been victory. But revenge doesn't taste sweet if it's served too soon. No, it needed to simmer. It needed layers. At first, I played the part of the silent landlord. I let them live their lives, completely unaware of what was coming. The irony was almost too much to bear. I'd drive by the building and see them coming out with shopping bags, laughing, spending money as though the world owed them comfort. They looked like royalty, walking proudly across the sidewalk, while I remembered the nights I slept cramped in that car because of their greed. But soon, cracks began to show, not in the building, but in their lives. It started with my daughter. She had married a man with a taste for luxuries he couldn't afford. Designer watches, expensive dinners, and a car that cost more than some houses. I knew his type the moment I met him, a man who measured success by the weight of his wallet, but didn't have the spine to actually earn it. I watched from the shadows as their bills piled up, their debts stretched thin, and their arguments grew louder behind the walls of the apartment I now owned. Then there was my son. He fancied himself a businessman. He boasted at family gatherings years ago that he'd outdo me, that he wouldn't spend his life with a hammer in his hand like the old man. He invested in flashy startups, one after the other, pouring money into promises that dissolved faster than smoke. I knew, because I'd once bailed him out when his first business collapsed. But this time he had no one to rescue him. He borrowed, begged, made deals that reeked of desperation. And all the while I sat quietly, receiving his rent payment each month. Small, punctual at first, then later. Late. The tension between them and me was invisible, a wire strung so tight that it hummed. They didn't know yet that I was the one pulling the string. They thought they were still in control of their lives, but I had learned patience from years of building homes brick by brick, and I would use that patience to dismantle theirs. One evening, while sitting in the dim light of my small office, I pulled out their rental files. Every landlord knows the power of paper, contracts, notices, rights, and responsibilities. These weren't just documents. They were weapons, sharp as knives when wielded properly, and I knew exactly when to strike. But then something happened that made my anger boil hotter than before. I overheard them. I had stopped by the building under the guise of routine maintenance, clipboard in hand, a cap pulled low on my head. I passed their open window and heard my daughter's voice, clear as a dagger. "Can you believe the old man's still alive? I bet he's rotting somewhere." "Honestly, good riddance," laughter followed. My son's voice added, "Yeah, he never knew when to quit. If he's not dead already, he should be. That way, at least, he won't be our problem anymore." Their words cut deeper than the night they threw me out. It wasn't enough that they abandoned me. It wasn't enough that they left me to the streets. They wanted me gone from the earth itself. That was when I decided revenge wasn't just justice anymore. It was necessity. I tightened the screws slowly. The first complication came when they fell behind on rent. At first it was just a few days late, then a week, then a month. I sent notices, official, stamped, cold. They panicked. They scrambled to pay, but their debts were rising faster than they could keep up. And I made sure the building wasn't as forgiving as I had once been as a father. The heat mysteriously shut off one winter. A plumbing issue surfaced, pipes groaning in the walls. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to make them miserable. Tenants complained, but I prioritized fixes strategically. Their complaints always took the longest. They thought it was bad luck, but I knew better. Misery has a way of breaking pride, one leak at a time. Then came the neighbors. You see, buildings aren't just bricks and mortar. They're communities. And I, as the landlord, had influence over who lived where. A family with noisy children moved in above them. A couple who argued into the night settled next door. Suddenly, the peace they thought was theirs was chipped away by chaos. They complained, of course, but my responses were polite, dismissive, always wrapped in legal language. I'll look into it. These things take time, all the while. I watched their lives unravel like old rope, but just as my plan gained momentum, a complication emerged, one I hadn't expected. My grandson. He was young, maybe 18, with eyes too honest to belong to my daughter or son. He came to me one evening, not knowing who I truly was, and asked shyly if I could give him a part-time job around the building. Sweeping hallways, fixing light bulbs, simple work. He said he wanted to help his parents, that times were hard. For a moment, my resolve wavered. Here was a boy, innocent, caught in the storm his parents created. He reminded me of myself at his age, desperate to prove worth, willing to work with his hands. I should have pushed him away. I should have hardened my heart. But I didn't. I hired him. And in those quiet hours, as we patched walls and swept stairs, he spoke to me. He told me of his parents' fights, of the mounting bills, of how he wished his family could be happy again. He didn't know I was the very storm that raged over them. He only knew me as Mr. Smith, the landlord. It complicated things, because revenge is clean when it's faceless. But when an innocent face is caught in the middle, the edges blur. Still, every time I thought of softening, I remembered that night in the car. The cold, the laughter from inside the house. The words, "You'll just drain us. Sleep in your car." And the fire returned. I decided then. My grandson might be innocent, but innocence couldn't shield him from the consequences of his parents' cruelty. If anything, perhaps watching their downfall would teach him the lesson they never learned. Respect isn't inherited. It's earned. By the time the second winter came, their debts had piled so high there was no climbing out. Eviction wasn't just an option anymore. It was inevitable. And I was the one holding the notice. But before I handed it over, I had one more complication to unravel, because what I uncovered next would make their suffering even deeper. And my revenge far sweeter than I had ever imagined. I held the eviction notice in my hand like a blade, sharp and ready to cut. But revenge, if rushed, loses its flavor. And something told me there was still more beneath the surface, more rot hiding in the walls of their lives. I had learned patience the hard way, sleeping in that car, counting the hours until sunrise. That same patience whispered to me now, "Wait, dig deeper." So I dug. It started with the late payments. My daughter would slip the envelope through the office door, sometimes short by a few dollars, sometimes not at all. Her husband began avoiding me in the hallways, pretending to take phone calls, his voice rising in fake importance as he passed. But what he didn't know was that I had eyes and ears all over the building. Tenants talked, word spread, and soon I discovered the truth. He was gambling. Not cards at the kitchen table, but high stakes online, where every click drained their savings faster than water leaking through a sieve. I pictured her sitting at the table late at night, bills spread before her, hands trembling as she tried to hide the truth from me, from everyone. I imagined his smirk as he lost another paycheck, promising her just one more game, one more win. I should have felt pity. Instead, I felt justice tightening its grip. Then there was my son. I thought his failures were just poor luck in business, but luck had little to do with it. Through a contact Frank introduced me to, an accountant who owed me a favor, I learned that my son had been running what you might call creative bookkeeping. In plain words, fraud. Small enough to stay under the radar, but large enough to ruin him if the right eyes ever saw it. He had been falsifying invoices, inflating expenses, shaving off profits. And all the while he was drowning in loans he couldn't repay. Here it was, the crack I had been waiting for. Not just financial weakness. Legal weakness. One tug on the thread, and his whole empire, flimsy as it was, would collapse. But the complication wasn't just in their secrets. It was in me. Every night, after discovering these things, I'd sit in my office with the lamp burning low, papers spread out before me, and my grandson's face would return to my mind. He had no part in this. He came faithfully to sweep the floors, tighten the bolts, mop the stairwells. He never complained. He'd even save me a sandwich from his lunch, setting it quietly on the desk before going back to work. One evening, as we sat together on the stoop outside the building, he said something that nearly broke me. "Mr. Smith," he said. He still didn't know I was his grandfather. "Do you ever feel like no matter how hard you work, it's never enough? Like the people you're supposed to count on just don't see you?" I swallowed hard. His words were my own, spoken decades too late. I wanted to tell him the truth right there, to reveal that the man he thought was just his landlord was, in fact, the grandfather his parents had erased. But I didn't, because if I revealed myself too soon, my revenge would lose its edge. And besides, he deserved to see who his parents really were before learning who I was. So I stayed silent. Meanwhile, my children's behavior grew worse. They began blaming each other openly. I could hear them through the walls when I visited the building. My daughter's voice sharp with accusation. "You're the reason we're broke. You waste everything on your stupid games." His roar in reply. "At least I'm not bleeding us dry with your shopping habits." Plates slammed, doors slammed, and beneath it all, their son, my grandson, withdrew further, his footsteps quieter, his shoulders heavier. My son, on the other hand, tried to save himself the only way he knew how, by scheming. He came to me one day, not realizing who I was beyond the landlord, and tried to charm me. He offered favors, hinted at partnership opportunities, even suggested he could help me invest my money if I gave him a break on the rent. I listened quietly, nodding as he spoke, pretending to consider it. Inside, I was laughing. The same man who once mocked me for being nothing but a laborer was now begging me to trust him with finances he couldn't even manage for himself. But the sweetest moment came when my daughter, desperate, tried to play on my supposed ignorance. She approached me with tears in her eyes, begging for an extension on the rent. She painted herself as the victim, told me her landlord was being unfair, heartless. She called me Mr. Smith with venom hidden behind her sobs. And all the while, she had no idea that the man she was pleading with was the father she had once called useless. I wanted to tell her then. I wanted to rip the mask off and watch her face crumble in realization. But I held back, because the true power of revenge is not in the reveal. It's in the moment after, when the weight of their actions crashes down like a collapsing roof. So I waited. But waiting brought another complication. Their financial ruin was inevitable, yes. Their eviction was signed, sealed, and ready. But my grandson, he was caught in the crossfire. And the more I watched him, the more I saw the cycle repeating. A young man trying to rise while being dragged down by the very people who should have lifted him up. Just as I had once been, I faced a choice. Let him fall with them, or find a way to separate him before the storm hit. I chose the latter. Quietly, I began to mentor him. I taught him how to fix things properly, not just the patchwork his parents would have settled for, but real craftsmanship. I told him stories, disguised as lessons about sacrifice, about how dignity comes from sweat, not handouts. He listened. He absorbed it all. He didn't know it, but I was building him just as carefully as I once built my first home. Meanwhile, the pressure on my children tightened. Their landlord, me, issued the final warning. Pay in full within 30 days or leave. Their panic was delicious. My daughter tried to borrow money from friends, but her reputation had spread. My son tried to secure investors, but his lies were catching up with him. And all the while, I prepared the final stroke of my plan, because eviction wasn't enough. No, I wanted them to feel what I had felt. The humiliation, the helplessness, the knowledge that the world didn't owe them comfort. So I arranged it. The date of their eviction would not be quiet. No early morning slip out the back. No silent retreat. It would be public. Tenants would watch. Neighbors would whisper. And for the first time, my children would taste the shame they had served me years before. But before that day arrived, One more truth surfaced, a truth that shifted everything once again. I wasn't the only one who knew about my son's fraud. The authorities had caught wind. An investigation had begun, and if things unraveled the way I suspected, his downfall wouldn't just be eviction. It would be handcuffs, and in that moment I realized my revenge had grown bigger than me. It wasn't just about teaching them a lesson anymore. It was about watching the universe, or maybe fate itself, finish what I had started. And I promised myself one thing as I prepared for the day of reckoning. When the dust settled, they would never look at me or at life itself. The same way again, the papers were ready. The signatures were in place. On the surface, it was nothing more than a routine eviction, the kind that happens every day in every city. But for me, it was the culmination of years of humiliation, patience, and quiet rebuilding. It was not just about removing tenants. It was about orchestrating justice, making sure every sting they had delivered to me came back tenfold. But revenge, I knew, is like construction. You don't swing the hammer until the foundation is set. And so I began laying out my plan with the same care I once gave to building my home, brick by brick. The first step was timing. Evictions, if handled discreetly, pass unnoticed. Families slip out at dawn with their boxes, shame hidden in silence. That wasn't enough for me. No, my children had made my shame public. Neighbors had whispered when they saw me curled in that car seat, reduced to nothing. I wanted their downfall to be just as public, just as humiliating. So I scheduled their eviction for a weekday morning, the busiest time, when tenants would be heading to work and neighbors walking their dogs. An audience was necessary. Next came the stage setting. I worked quietly with the property manager, a man who thought he was handling routine business. I made sure the notices weren't just mailed but taped boldly to their door in red ink. I wanted every passerby to see the word eviction before they even knocked. I arranged for movers not for their benefit but to make the process faster, louder, more visible. Every piece of furniture, every box of clothing, every scrap of luxury they had clung to would be carried out and dropped on the sidewalk like discarded trash. Just as they had once discarded me. But eviction alone wasn't enough. No, my children had not just taken my home. They had taken my dignity. And dignity required more than removal. It required exposure. So I prepared the financial trap. You see, I knew about my son's fraud. I had the documents, the proof, the trail of lies he had crafted to prop up his failing ventures. With a few phone calls to the right department, anonymously, of course, I made sure that his business practices would not stay hidden much longer. It wasn't malicious. It was factual. The law would do the rest. All I did was light the match under the pile of dry wood he himself had stacked. As for my daughter, her husband's gambling debts were a fire waiting to ignite. I reached out quietly to one of the men he owed money to, not as myself, but through an old acquaintance who still had ties to less than patient lenders. I didn't instruct them, didn't threaten. I simply made sure they knew exactly where he lived, exactly when he'd be home. Debts collect themselves when enough pressure is applied. Meanwhile, I focused on my grandson. This was the only part of my plan that required restraint. The boy was innocent, his heart still unspoiled by greed. I had watched him sweep floors with a kind of dignity his parents could never grasp. I couldn't let him collapse with them. So, in the weeks leading up to the eviction, I began preparing a place for him. Not just a roof, but a future. I had a small workshop property, one I had once used to store tools and materials. I cleaned it up, set aside a corner with a proper bed, and stocked it with supplies. It wasn't much, but it was safe, solid, his, if he chose it. I also began speaking to him more directly, teaching him lessons disguised as conversations. You know, I told him one afternoon as we repaired a leaky faucet, a man's worth isn't in what he owns, but in what he can build with his hands. Money disappears. Houses crumble. But skill? Skill will keep you alive when everything else is gone. He nodded, absorbing every word. He didn't know yet how soon he'd need those lessons. As the eviction date drew closer, I added the final touches. I spoke with the tenants in the building, planting small seeds. I didn't name names, but I hinted that there would be changes soon, that certain tenants were causing issues with unpaid rent. People love to talk, and word spread quickly. By the time the notices appeared, The whispers were already circling like vultures. I wanted the eyes of the building not just on the eviction day, but on the days leading up to it. Suspense was part of the punishment. Then I prepared myself. The night before the eviction, I sat alone in my office. The desk was clear except for two objects: the final eviction notice and a photograph. The photograph was old, faded, worn from being handled too many times. It was of me, my wife, and the children when they were small. Their smiles were wide, their eyes innocent. My wife's hand rested on my shoulder. We had built that family together, brick by brick, just as I had built the house. And they had torn it down, not with fire or storm, but with words sharper than any blade. I looked at that photograph for a long time. Part of me, the part that was still a father, wondered if I was going too far. If perhaps eviction, public humiliation, and financial ruin were punishments too cruel, even for betrayal this deep. But then I remembered the cold nights in the car. The neighbors' whispers, the sound of their laughter as I shivered outside my own home. And my doubt hardened into resolve. When the sun rose the next morning, I was ready. I dressed not in my work clothes, not in the plain shirts I usually wore, but in a suit. Nothing extravagant, but sharp, dignified. I wanted them to see me not as the broken man they had tossed aside, but as the man I had always been, strong, unyielding, capable. I arrived early, long before the movers or the tenants stirred. I stood across the street, watching the windows of their apartment. Lights flickered on, shadows moved inside. They had no idea what awaited them. One by one, the pieces of my plan began to fall into place. The property manager arrived with his clipboard. The movers pulled up with their truck, loud and heavy, drawing the eyes of every passerby. Tenants peeked through blinds, lingered in hallways, curious about the commotion, exactly as I intended. And then, the moment came. The eviction notice, bold and final, was taped to their door. The knock followed. My children answered, confusion in their eyes as they saw the crew outside, the property manager waiting, the neighbors gathering. And then finally they saw me, standing there, calm, silent, watching. Their faces shifted from confusion to recognition, then to horror. My daughter's lips parted, but no words came out. My son's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as though trying to convince himself it wasn't real, but it was real. It was happening, and it was only the beginning. The look on their faces when they opened the door was everything I had imagined, and more. My daughter's eyes went wide, her breath catching like she had seen a ghost. My son, ever the proud one, tried to square his shoulders and meet my gaze, but his lips trembled, betraying the fear he couldn't hide. They hadn't expected me. They hadn't even thought of me. In their minds, I was gone, buried, forgotten, erased. But here I was, standing tall, dressed in a suit, holding the power they thought they had stolen. The property manager cleared his throat and began reading from the notice. His voice was formal, dry, detached, but I wasn't listening to him. I was watching my children crumble piece by piece in front of an audience. Tenants lined the hallway, whispering, their eyes darting from the notice to my children, then back to me. Some shook their heads, others smirked. I could hear faint laughter from the stairwell. Every sound echoed like thunder in that narrow hall. My daughter tried to interrupt, her voice shrill. There must be some mistake. We paid. The manager cut her off with a shake of his head. You're 3 months behind. The documents are clear. The owner has been more than patient. Her husband stepped forward then, his arrogance faltering into desperation. Maybe we can work something out, he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. A private arrangement. I raised my hand, silencing him. No deals, I said. My voice was calm, steady, but it carried the weight of every cold night I had endured in that car. You had your chance. Now you'll face the consequences. The movers began their work. Piece by piece, their life was carried out into the open. A flat-screen television hauled down the stairs by 2 men grunting under its weight. Boxes filled with designer clothes, handbags, shoes, all stacked on the curb like discarded trash. The sofa, the dining table, the bed frame, everything they had once flaunted as proof of their success now sat in plain sight for the neighbors to see, and the neighbors were watching. They gathered on sidewalks, peering from windows, murmuring. Some even pulled out phones, recording the spectacle. My children, who once bathed in pride, were now drowning in humiliation. Every whisper, every camera flash was a nail in the coffin of the image they had tried to build. My son clenched his fists. He stormed toward me, fury in his eyes. "You think this makes you better than us?" "You think—" I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply looked at him, and in that silence I could see the realization dawning on him. He knew, he finally knew. "You," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's you. You're the landlord," my daughter gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. No, it can't be." "But it was." And in that moment every truth unraveled. The man they had mocked, the father they had discarded, the burden they thought they had erased. He was the one holding their fate in his hands. "Yes," I said simply. "It's me," the crowd's whispers swelled into a storm. Some tenants muttered in disgust, others chuckled in disbelief. A few even clapped quietly, as though justice had been served before their very eyes. But I wasn't done, because humiliation, while satisfying, was only one layer of my revenge. The real storm was still coming. As the last of their belongings hit the curb, two men in dark suits appeared at the edge of the crowd. They weren't movers. They weren't tenants. They were debt collectors. The ones I had quietly ensured knew exactly when and where to find my daughter's husband. His face drained of color the moment he saw them. He stammered, sweat breaking across his forehead as they approached. Their voices were low, but the threat was clear. His gambling debts had come due, and they weren't the forgiving kind. My daughter clutched his arm, her panic plain.
"What's happening?"
"Who are they?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. His silence told her everything. At the same time, two officers pulled up in a patrol car, stepping into the crowd. They asked for my son by name. His fraud had caught up with him, just as I had known it would. His protests rang hollow as they recited his charges. Neighbors gasped, some shaking their heads, others whispering furiously. And my grandson, standing in the corner of the crowd, wide-eyed, watched his father led away in handcuffs. It should have been the sweetest moment of my life. Every humiliation, every betrayal, every cold night in that car had led to this, their downfall, their disgrace, their ruin. But then my grandson turned his eyes to me. He didn't look at me with anger. He didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me with confusion. Confusion and a quiet plea for answers. And that was when I knew the time for secrecy was over. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. The crowd was still buzzing, still pointing, still feeding on the spectacle. But in that moment, it felt like only the two of us existed. "Do you know who I am, boy?" I asked gently. He shook his head. You're Mr. Smith, the landlord." I placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "No, I'm your grandfather. The man they told you was useless. The man they threw out like trash." His eyes widened, his lips parted, but no words came. He looked from me to his parents, then back to me. And slowly I saw it, the realization, the truth, the cracks in the lies he had been told his whole life. I leaned closer, my voice low, steady. "Remember this moment. Remember what pride and greed did to them. Don't become them. Build your own life, brick by brick, with your own hands. That is the only way to stand tall." For the first time since this all began, I saw tears in his eyes. He nodded just once, but it was enough. Behind us, my children screamed, cursed, begged. They tried to claw back the dignity that had already slipped through their fingers. But it was too late. Their belongings lay in the street, their debts pressed down on their shoulders, their reputations shattered. And I stood tall, not as a victim, not as a broken man, but as the architect of their downfall. Yet even then, I knew this was not the end. The eviction, the arrests, the humiliation, they were the walls of the structure I had built. But the roof, the final piece, was still to come. Because revenge is not complete until the very last nail is hammered in, and I had one final nail left to drive. The eviction itself was a storm, but storms pass. Belongings on the sidewalk, neighbors whispering, police cars flashing. That was chaos. But I hadn't waited years just for chaos. No. Revenge needed a finishing stroke, something so sharp and final that it would etch itself into their memory forever. That stroke came in the days that followed. My daughter and her husband, now stripped of their apartment and drowning in gambling debt, tried to move in with friends. But word spreads fast in a community. People saw the eviction. They saw the collectors. Friends became scarce. Doors that once opened easily were suddenly locked tight. They tried hotels, motels, anywhere to find shelter. But without money or reputation, those doors closed too. My son, meanwhile, faced charges. Fraud is not a small thing, not when you've stolen from investors and lied on official documents. His bail was high, higher than he could ever afford. He called me from the holding cell, his voice low and desperate. "Dad, please, help me. I'll pay you back. I'll change. I swear I'll change." I let the silence hang between us, the same silence I had endured when I begged for a place to stay. Then, finally, I answered, "I slept in my car for months while you laughed inside the house I built. You never once opened the door. Why should I open it now?" He choked on his reply, but I ended the call before he could finish. That was the difference. They thought family was a one-way road, a vein they could drain without ever giving back. I had shown them the truth. Every road can close. Every vein can run dry, but the real blow, the poetic justice, came when the building itself shifted hands. You see, when they first realized I was the owner, they thought eviction meant losing their roof, nothing more. What they didn't understand was that the building represented something larger. It was stability, community, reputation, and I had every intention of making sure they could never return to that stability again. I called a meeting with the tenants. In that meeting, I laid out my vision: improvements, upgrades, lower rents for those who had been loyal. But I also spoke plainly. I told them how some tenants, without naming my children, had disrespected their obligations, dragging everyone else down. I emphasized that responsibility, honesty, and respect were the values I would demand moving forward. The message was clear. The entire community now knew the truth. My children weren't victims. They were the rot that had weakened the foundation, and when rot is found, it is cut away. My daughter returned once more, this time not screaming or crying, but broken. She stood on the curb outside my office, hair disheveled, eyes hollow. My grandson stood behind her, watching silently. "Dad," she whispered, voice trembling, "we have nowhere to go. Please, please forgive us. Please help us." I studied her, the same girl whose tuition I had once paid, whose meals I had once worked double shifts to provide. I thought of her small hands clutching mine when she was young, her laughter echoing in the house I built. And then I thought of her words years later. "You'll just drain us. Sleep in your car." Forgiveness, I realized, is not always mercy. Sometimes it is weakness, and I had no weakness left to give. "You made your choice," I said. My voice didn't rise, didn't falter. "Now live with it." She fell to her knees, sobbing. My grandson didn't move to comfort her. He only looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something unexpected. Not anger, not hatred, but understanding. That was the moment I drove in the final nail. I reached into my coat pocket and handed him a key. "A single, heavy key. This is to the workshop property," I told him quietly. "It's small, but it's yours if you want it. Work hard, take care of it, and you'll never end up like them." His hands trembled as he took it. He didn't say thank you, not then. He only nodded, clutching it to his chest like it was the first real gift he'd ever been given. My daughter looked up, her face streaked with tears. "You'll help him, but not us." I met her gaze. "He hasn't betrayed me. You have." And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving her kneeling in the dirt, my grandson holding the key to a future she had thrown away. In the weeks that followed, everything fell into place. My son's fraud charges stuck. He was sentenced, his arrogance stripped as he traded his tailored suits for prison clothes. My daughter's husband disappeared into the shadows of debt collectors, leaving her to face the consequences alone. And my grandson, he came to the workshop. He worked, he learned. Slowly, he began to build something of his own, away from the poison of his parents. As for me, I slept soundly for the first time in years. Not in a car, not in fear, but in peace, because my revenge wasn't just in their downfall. It was in reclaiming my dignity, in proving that a man who builds from nothing can rise again, stronger than ever. They made me sleep in my car. I made them sleep on the streets. But the true victory, they lost everything, and I gained something they could never steal back. My legacy, revenge is never clean. It doesn't fix the past. It doesn't erase the nights I spent shivering in that car, staring through the glass at the home I built with my bare hands. But it does something almost sweeter. It balances the scales. My children thought age made me powerless, that time had stolen my strength. What they forgot is that wisdom and patience are weapons sharper than any blade. They laughed while I slept in my car, but in the end, I laughed last, watching them reduced to the very streets they once thought beneath them. Now, when I walk past that building, tenants nod respectfully. My grandson works steadily at the workshop, and my name, the name they tried to bury, stands taller than ever. They thought a car seat was my retirement bed. Instead, it was the place where I began designing their downfall, and they'll never forget it.